WebRTC is, so I won't be talking about that. But I'm going to talk about WebRTC Won and what we can do next. So if you don't know me already, my name is Chad Hart. I head a strategic products group over at Voxbone, where I work on a bunch of fun things, including WebRTC. I've been working with WebRTC for quite some time. I, with a few others, started a blog, WebRTC Hacks, which is I have some of you in this room and people speaking at this conference have been great contributors to as a blog for technical developers. And I also work with Google and others and run some WebRTC events. Our next one is coming up on October 27th in San Francisco. So, WebRTC Won, that's a pretty bold statement. And I've been working with WebRTC for a while, so I kind of feel like it has, because of where I've been, but I decided to go back and let's pull some data and prove it to you guys, right? Is WebRTC really winning? Can we prove this? And I started out, I went to LinkedIn and like, it should be pretty easy to see. There's got to be more WebRTC people than there are VoIP people and SIP people. And I was surprised, actually. I mean, there was a decent amount of WebRTC people, but nowhere near the number of VoIP, right? Now, keep in mind, this is a very basic search. I just put in SIP, right? SIP is just a 3-letter acronym. So I filtered that a little bit to do my third-order network. But still, WebRTC is nowhere close. And I thought there'd be a lot more jobs for WebRTC, being it's a new technology and such a popular thing posted there. But they didn't really show up too well either. So this really started to get me concerned, because I already submitted my abstract for WebRTC Won, and it was a little bit too late to change. So I did a little bit more research. I went on Google Trends. And I should be careful here. Not all these, Google warns you that all these terms are like for like. I mean, they have topics that you search for, which are different than key search terms. But, comparing even WebRTC versus SIP trunking was, it was above SIP trunking, right? It went there, but nowhere near the topic of SIP or nowhere near the topic of VoIP. So then I was really starting to get concerned. So I went to GitHub, right, where all the developers go, and figured, well, maybe the developer data will show something different. And this looked a lot better. So this, again, just a very basic search. Just going to GitHub and plug it in there. WebRTC is ahead. But that's kind of crude, right? Not everyone's going to have WebRTC or asterisk in their repo title, right? What we really care about are people who are actively working with the code on doing this. And previously for WebRTC Hacks, I had done some analysis on GitHub. GitHub actually publishes their data to Google BigQuery. So you can go to Google BigQuery and actually query every GitHub push that's happened ever, or at least since 2000, not ever, but since 2011. So I went back and I updated some of my data. And this looks a whole lot better, right? And you can see it certainly looks good up and to the right. There's a lot of different ways to cut this data. I filtered based on, does the repo name contain WebRTC or ORTC? But at the end, you got to be careful on how you filter things. So it's not 100% perfect. And I also actually looked at the content and the body of the code pushes, right, to see actually is this a really WebRTC? And I filtered not only on some of the key search terms here, but all the major WebRTC APIs that people might call, right? And important thing to note here, this is these are active users or active repos for that given month, right? So if somebody goes, they're learning WebRTC, they go and they create a repo, name it WebRTC, whatever, and then walk away. I mean, they'll show up here for 1 month, but they won't show up again, right? So this shows pretty good that there's actually a growing volume of people using WebRTC and a growing number of repos and a growing number of active users of this too, right? And just the cumulative numbers here, if you add up the total, this seems about reasonable, I guess, compared to some of the other data sources. I still would expect a little bit more, but it's quite a bit. So this all looks good, but what does that mean? Is that actually good? Because GitHub hasn't been around forever. It's a popular new place to put your code, so maybe a lot of this growth can be attributed to just the overall growth of GitHub. So I took a look and ran some data to look at all the GitHub data. And this is running the same methodology, just looking at total number of active users and active repos across all of GitHub. Now, it's important to note, the scale of GitHub is just massive. Right? There's, over 2.2 million active repos there, right? So which says something about GitHub as a place for developers. But you can see here, WebRTC, even in comparison here, it is, it's keeping up with GitHub, and you can see some periods where it actually was far ahead of the growth of GitHub. And it's a little tougher to see here, but I think there's a slight, in terms of users, a slight, growth over the overall GitHub user growth, or active user growth here too. So then, well, this got me thinking too, since I was playing around with the data set and had it in front of me, like I'm, wondering how this would compare against Asterisk and Asterisk growth. And since now the Asterisk repo has been cloned over on GitHub too. So I actually took a look at some of the more popular or the larger open source, telecom, telephony repos, including Asterisk, FreeSwitch, Camilio, and OpenSIPs. And certainly a lot more analysis and digging in here, but I looked at that, and it's very interesting to see here that WebRTC started out. I mean, a lot of these products have been around. The projects have been around a lot longer than WebRTC, so they started out a little bit higher here, and you can see a middle period here where WebRTC actually got ahead a little bit, and then then the open source stuff pulled ahead. Now, I should say, these are not mutually exclusive, right? You can have an open source project that uses WebRTC, and most of them do. And actually, I suspect that's probably what's starting to happen here. If I had more time, and I do hope I'll dig into this, but I suspect, in this time frame of 2014 or so, that roughly matches when a lot of the big, open source projects, started to add a lot more WebRTC, and people got a lot more involved in the open source community. So I think if I was filter this out, I mean, I suspect a lot of the growth in the open source stuff is very much WebRTC related. And so that's developers, people building stuff for WebRTC. But at the end of the day, this is the business track. What matters is users, right? And things that bring in that pay the bills. And I ran this last year after WebRTC's 5th anniversary. And you can see here, WebRTC, if you look at how it's done after 5 years, just totally crushes, most other, technologies, at least the ones I could easily analyze, like Skype, and looking at voice over LTE and RCS and IMS for Dean in the audience. I hope we get to hear you talk about that a little bit tomorrow. But so this is pretty strong evidence here that there's a lot of value in WebRTC if it can grow so quick. And it's really just getting started, and I should point out here also is that for some of these services, it's inherent that you're going to use the service. If you have a voice over LTE phone, generally that's might be dictated by your carrier. There's no difference between the device capability and the user using it. The numbers I use for WebRTC here are actually active monthly users here, and there's way more devices out there that can support WebRTC than there are active monthly users. All right, so there's a lot of room for very easy growth there as a result. And that was a snapshot after 5 years. I wish I used to be an industry analyst and have access to a lot of data. I don't anymore. I still have a couple sources, but I looked for rough numbers to see how is WebRTC doing today versus the other services, and it's still even on comparing to where they are today, be it after 10 years or more for Skype, and the same is true for some of the other technologies. WebRTC is still crushing it. So, despite some of my initial concerns, I feel pretty good that WebRTC is definitively winning here, right? So let's look at why is WebRTC winning? Well, one, it is the newest technology, right? It includes a lot of the state of the art of VoIP. It's not hard to go, and people want to use the latest and greatest, right? So a lot of that's in WebRTC. It also doesn't hurt that WebRTC it's open source, it's free. It's been promoted as free. There's no cost, right? That certainly helps. I think one of the biggest factors is the large open source community around WebRTC. Now, coming from Google and having Google invest heavily in it in the beginning to get that started, certainly helped to bring it along. But more so than any other project, and this is proven out by the GitHub data. There's a lot of people just focused on this one technology, right? So that brings a really big and active community, right? And the barriers to entry here are pretty low. If you want to get started with WebRTC, you don't need to be a VoIP expert. You don't need to know anything about, SIP or protocols. You just need to know a little bit of JavaScript, and pretty much I'm betting anyone can get going and do it in 15 minutes or you can run through the Google Code Lab that they have online, with minimal knowledge of running a web server in an hour or two. Right? So the barriers to entry, at least to get started, are very low. And it doesn't help that the existing phones and systems that we have, I mean, they've been more or less the same, right? And oftentimes that's not good. And we live in a world where user experience interface, and needs and our expectations are constantly evolving, right? Every time there's a new device or major software update, the user experience, the user interaction capabilities of what you have in your phone, they're changing all the time, right? And we don't really realize this because it's happening all the time, but the web is oriented towards moving with those changes, right? It's really hard to do that when you're dealing with a fixed phone with 9 digits that you can touch and 12 digits, and that's all you can do, right? So WebRTC lends itself really well to these future technologies. And looking forward and going into some of the newer forms of real-time communications and where people are adding real-time where it wasn't necessarily before or certainly wasn't optimized, WebRTC is a really perfect fit for things like adding real-time communications, the gaming and the Internet of Things and virtual reality, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But still, it kind of bothered me, like why aren't there more people doing WebRTC? Like why aren't there more job openings? How come we don't see the WebRTC term more, right? And that's people, you can't mix up WebRTC. That's a very distinct search term, unlike SIP. So I was a little surprised that I didn't see more there. So I think there's a couple reasons for this. I mean, one, if you look at some of the largest WebRTC providers out there, and Facebook Messenger is a pretty good example of running. I think they're up to 400 million active users now, right? It really just doesn't take a whole lot of developers to run a network at that scale. And this is a recent example. Slack recently presented this. I mean, they've been working on WebRTC. I assume many of you are probably familiar with Slack or might use it. So they certainly have a pretty big user base, to start with, and they've added real-time communications into their application, to their product. But essentially, it was 12, on average, about 12 man years to get them up to 1 million minutes a day. Now, 1 million minutes a day is not really that big in the scheme of everyone out there and other communications providers. But after 2 years with 12 man years of effort, that's pretty good. And I'm willing to bet they'll be able to double or triple that really without adding more people. And WhatsApp is another good example of web scale. Now their core platform is not based on WebRTC. They use WebRTC for some of the web calling capabilities and other aspects, but the core thing is. But the principle of building a stack, right, that's cloud friendly, can just run on these public clouds and scales up really without difficulty, is very relevant across the board here, right? Once you build the core system, once you get that handful of people you need to get things going, you can scale up and add a lot of users. You don't necessarily need to add more people, right? And that's the idea. You want to be able to support a very, very large volume of users with a small number of people, because that's how you make money here. And WebRTC, more so than any of these other technologies, fits very well into that web mobile-oriented architecture that can suit that scalability. I think the other factor here is that a lot of WebRTC users out there, they're just web developers, right? And a web developer, they don't go put on their resume that, hey, I know how to use the Canvas and web audio, and they don't list off all these little boxes. They say they're a web developer, and perhaps they specialize in one area or another. But if they use WebRTC, they might not think it's that big a deal, right? It's just, to them, WebRTC is just another web API, right, along with the other ones, right? It's nothing special. And there's a lot more web developers out there than there are telephony developers, right? And I suspect a lot of the users out there fall into this category. So next, WebRTC Won. All right, it's great. We should do it. So now what? And if you're not doing it already, is now a good time to start? So there's a whole list of excuses. I don't have time to go through all of them today, but I picked out a couple of the most popular ones or common ones. One, complaining about standards, right? And the standards aren't done. And it's true, actually, the standards aren't completely finalized. The get user media to get your audio microphone, that the media capture API, that one's effectively done. The peer connection one is still not 100% finalized in terms of W3C. right? And a lot of the main reasons for that come down to something that most of the telephony VoIP people in here are very familiar with. It's session description protocol, right? And there was a lot of arguments over time whether this should be included. There was a parallel standard and alternatives that were introduced called ORTC, Object RTC. Most of those APIs and recommendations actually have been built into WebRTC, but the core WebRTC 1.0 spec still uses SDP. And we're pushing SDP to do things that it wasn't really designed to do when it was first invented. I think it was certainly more than 10 years ago, quite some time ago. And as a result, when we're trying to do more advanced functionality like selective forwarding units, which I won't talk about here, but advanced video architectures, getting people to agree on how to do this stuff in SDP is actually kind of difficult, right? And WebRTC 1.0 is committed to maintain backwards compatibility and maintain some of these mechanisms. So that's really what's holding things up. But in practice, unless you're in one of those deep nitty-gritty issues, none of this matters. If you are in one of those deep nitty-gritty issues, you're probably deploying WebRTC and doing this stuff already, otherwise you wouldn't care, right? So if you're not, generally this stuff is handled by the people who do deal with the stacks and the lower levels, and it's really not slowing anyone down. It's certainly not slowing down Facebook or Snapchat or any other major users out there, Google Hangouts that are using WebRTC with hundreds of millions of users, daily active users out there, right? This is not slowing down. So I don't think standards are a really good excuse, certainly not anymore. Now, the other good excuse, which I do believe was a little more legitimate, is this browser doesn't support it, right? And this was certainly true. And fortunately, this just changed recently. So Chrome, Firefox have always had pretty good support, right? Internet Explorer is a lost cause, right? And it's a lost cause to Microsoft, and they're actively trying to push people off of Internet Explorer towards Windows 10 and Edge, which does have good WebRTC support. And the last holdout that was a real pain in the butt was Safari. And just as of a couple weeks ago, WebRTC is now generally available in Safari, both on desktop and on iOS. And that's a big deal. They were really the last holdout. So I say the only remaining issues out there, again, if you write off Internet Explorer because it's essentially deprecated, it might not help if you have a big user base that's still on that, and there certainly are pockets of users out there who are still in Internet Explorer, and there are solutions like plugins that you can use to fix them. So I still argue that's not that much of a barrier. But I think the remaining big challenges are for Google with Chrome and Mozilla with Firefox to add the WebRTC capabilities into iOS where they can't, right? And this is a tricky situation because the way Apple works is they force you to use their own web rendering engine called WebKit, right? So even if you're Google, you have the best web rendering engine in the world, which they claim or have in the past, right? You can't use that, right? You have to use the Apple one as part of iOS. So now that WebRTC is in that core WebKit, I think we'll start to see WebRTC come. It might take 6 months to a year or so, but you'll see more or less ubiquitous WebRTC support across every browser and every environment, right? And I do want to emphasize here as well, like you need to look, I mean, these are rough numbers and I try to keep updated, but you do need to consider where your users are, right? And the percentages. So this is a rough global average based on what I'd be able to roughly approximate. If you really care about specific numbers, you can pay some research firms a lot of money and they'll give you a monthly update for this. But certainly if you have a lot of users that are in one of these categories that doesn't support it, then WebRTC is not going to be a fit for you. The positive news is though, in general, those numbers for the people that don't support WebRTC have generally been shrinking, and they're smaller and smaller. And the only one I'd say that's really significant today is Internet Explorer, right? Just for some holdouts, generally due to older IT policies and just purchase cycles of updates that haven't moved over to Edge yet. I also did want to talk about native environments because it's easy to talk about WebRTC and just think web, right? But WebRTC is way more than just the web, right? And that really evolved pretty quickly. In fact, the majority of usage of WebRTC is not even on the web, it's on mobile, right? Most of Facebook Messenger users there and in Google Hangouts, Google Duo, and Snapchat, they're all mobile apps, right? So a lot of the traffic is coming from native mobile. And the good news there is, WebRTC is actually very, very well supported on Android. Not a big surprise there coming from Google, right? But Microsoft, even on native Windows, for Windows 10, has built in WebRTC into its universal Windows platform, right? So now for Windows 10, it's actually very simple, via NuGet packages to add WebRTC and that WebRTC stack to your project. And certainly the last holdout has really been with Apple, and with this recent update, building WebRTC into their native WebKit and WebView, things will change there pretty quick too. So all the major native platforms are pretty well covered, and I'd say a lot of the non-major platforms, a lot of the Linux platforms, all that, you can get pretty easy support. This has been around for a while, and there's been a lot of effort into making WebRTC easy to consume across any environment, and I think it's pretty tough to find a popular platform now that doesn't have some sort of native bindings or easy mechanism to build. And the last complaint is often WebRTC is buggy, and sometimes this is true. WebRTC is still changing. It's new. It happens, right? There's always caveats. For example, it's great, iOS is now in Safari, right? But it won't just work out of the bat. You actually have to go and update some of your HTML tags to make it work, which is kind of annoying, but that's the way Apple did things, so you need to go back and fix that. Is it that big of a deal? Probably not in the end of the day, but it's one other thing you need to do. There's other caveats, like there's no data channels in Microsoft Edge, right? They never built in the data channel functionality. If you're using that and you have a service, that's a pretty big deal. And Safari and doesn't support VP8 either, right? So if you have a service that's based on VP8 and has that video codec, that can be annoying. A lot of these things will be worked through, but at the end of the day, and there's a lot more, but a lot of this is certainly not a showstopper. It hasn't been stopping, again, hundreds of millions of users from using this before, right? But you do need to be prepared and know how to work around some of these issues. There's a lot to go through here, but it's important to remember that WebRTC is not the same as Telecom. In a lot of ways, actually, WebRTC is not really the same as the web either, right? It borrows from both and mixes and matches. So when you look at items like NAT traversal, traditionally, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but historically, most of the time, certainly in enterprise environments and service provider environments, you had an SBC that handled NAT traversal. On the web, no one thinks about like NAT traversal if they know what it is. If you're dealing with some IoT app or mobile app, you're probably dealing with a pub sub type architecture already. Where WebRTC has that taken care of as part of ICE and turn architecture, but it means you need to implement a turn server, right? That's something new. A new element that hasn't existed before. Load balancing is certainly very different, right? It's really a mixture of what you do traditionally in telecom and the web. The user experience UI, particularly when I'm talking here about the end user, right? Traditionally in telecom, if you're plugging into somebody else's IP phone, the user experience is somebody else's problem, right? You don't have to worry about that. On the web started with the user interface, right? And basically the whole back end and everything else was built around that front end interaction. And WebRTC is still, I'd say, for the successful services, they're more like the web, right? The focus is on the front end and user interaction elements. Interop is another interesting one too, right? For WebRTC, the number one solution to interop is this thing called Adapter.js, right? Which is essentially helps to adapt your code across any browser, and it's actively maintained by all the browser vendors with a huge community support, and actually works pretty well in most cases. So we talked a little bit about some of the tech issues, but this is the business track. I did want to talk a little bit about how do you make money off of WebRTC? What can you do with it? And I see 4 major business models. One, you can build a new app, right? You can add WebRTC to existing app. You can make tools for other people to build apps, or you can just develop other people's apps for them, right? And some examples here. This is one, I'm from Boston. This is a Boston company, FAM. It's a video calling app. You would think that there's plenty of video calling apps out there. Why do we need another one? Well, they set themselves up to piggyback on iMessage, right, and allow group messaging from group video from iMessage, and they got 1 million users in 10 days launching this, and got additional funding and are doing pretty well, right? So I certainly would have said the world doesn't need another video calling app. Aren't there plenty of them out there? But there's many examples of companies finding success, right? Focusing on a certain niche, right, and really optimizing around that niche and building a really good experience, right, and getting a lot of growth and traction as a result. All right, another one of my favorite examples of adding WebRTC to an existing app is here in the U.S., the Department of Veterans Affairs. Pretty notorious for not serving its customers well and having a lot of issues. They've had a recent big telehealth initiative and are adding telehealth video for remote communication with your doctor right inside their app. And I think this is really interesting. If a beleaguered non-respected government agency can figure out how to add WebRTC to their app and have pretty good success doing, I'm pretty sure everyone else here can too. All right, the third category I didn't have a pretty slide for. It's developing tools for other people, and really the modern term for this now is a communications platform as a service, right? It's when you add your development tools to the cloud, and that's what you get. I think ultimately, the big name here is Twilio. You're probably gonna have a hard time, or you need to be really creative if you wanted to compete with Twilio, where they are today, just trying to have something head to head. But there's plenty of niches and applications and things you can go after. And at the end of the day, a lot of times when you're building your own services and capabilities, it's nice to have your own platform as a service that you can use internally. And if you have customers that come along and need something customer special, or some other product team that needs something, you can leverage that same platform, right? So the CPaaS approach of building development tools, I think has pretty broad applicability, even if you don't sell it directly. Right, and the fourth category, which I think has probably been the most successful, widely successful one I've seen in WebRTC, is just to be a development shop, right? Learn how to do, build WebRTC, and it certainly fits, some of the businesses in here is just learn how to do this, right? There's a lot of opportunities to build WebRTC, be it real-time voice, video, into web pages, into mobile apps, right? And as a development shop, one of the advantages of WebRTC is that you can get web developers, which are generally lower cost than VoIP engineers and VoIP architects to help do a lot of this work, right? So I've seen WebRTC really take off and do these development shops do pretty well in helping other people build their apps. So as I start to wrap up, I'd like to talk a little bit about, all right, where's all this going? What's next here? And I'd say, my first, prediction here is, I think, I said earlier, it doesn't seem to make sense. Why do we need all these video calling apps? But I think there's going to be more, right? And I'll go through. This is an example of these are all actually video calling apps, but the use case doesn't necessarily have to just be video, right? You have services that are just dedicated towards doing live chilling, right? For hanging out with your friends after school, right? Targeted towards that same audience, right? There's apps like Google Duo that are optimized just for one-to-one calling. That's all they do. They're just one-to-one person, right? They're designed to do really fast, really simple, integrate really well with your contact books, but that's all they do. They're really specialized in that use case. There's other apps that are dedicated for, like Discord for video gaming, right? You're doing group video gaming with your friends, right? You need some way of communicating, right? Discord is one example. There are others of apps that do that. There's other cases where maybe you want to broadcast yourself, right? You're not playing with other people. You want to broadcast yourself to the world, right? That's what Twitch does. And then there might be other times that it's late at night. You want to just watch some TV, watch Game of Thrones with your friends, right? There's an app to help you do that, right? You can actually be in a video call and actually watch TV together. You're remotely, you're separated apart, but it's kind of close, the next best thing to being in the same room to watching something together. These are all examples of different apps, right, and different use cases. They all, all these are marketed towards the same, millennial type crowd, right? No one's trying to be the be-all, end-all of communications for all these, right? They're specializing in one very unique niche and going after that use case and just being the best application, best product possible for that specific use case, and not trying to be anything else, all right? And that's how a lot of these these applications are being successful. And there's so many of these use cases and applications, across so many different segments and markets and geographies. And as a result, I think we're going to see a lot more apps, right? Not a lot less, right? The underlying technology is not really all that different in most of these cases, right? But the use case and how people perceive them and how they use them is very different, right? Other interesting trends I see coming. With the growth of intelligent home assistants like Amazon Alexa and Google Home, we're seeing a lot better microphones for dealing with stereo audio. When you start to get into doing virtual reality, right, you get binaural audio type fields, and you get far field microphones. So I think we'll start to see some interesting things happen when you're dealing with multiple microphone streams and how you can handle some of this. And along the same lines, right, we're starting to see a lot more of these crazy cameras, right? As people get into VR and AR, right, you need to capture not just one little narrow focus, but the whole world around, right? And that really shifts the focus and some of the challenges of WebRTC's. Instead of dealing with one video stream coming from a device, how do you deal with dozens, right? And manage that in a way that's still effective. And lastly, I think we'll start to see, this has been happening already, right? We see, real-time communications penetrate everywhere, right? It's already part of smart home, smart doorbells. It's already part of some of these home assistants. It's in toys out there already that use WebRTC, and it's in, like Amazon has their Alexa Show, right? This is all based on WebRTC. But even beyond the home, I think some of the more interesting use cases that maybe we don't think about that are the better business opportunities, especially for a lot of the people in the room here, is in work environments. And I'm not talking about desk job environments, more industrial or agriculture or out in the field. So certainly dealing with drones and managing video feeds out there is a big topic. This next one's, GE, their Predix group actually has some pretty sophisticated WebRTC capabilities built into some of their sensors and monitors. If you have a tech out there trying to fix an engine that's worth tens of millions of dollars, and that's can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a day every time it's down, having someone back in the office that's really skilled in being able to see the video feed to help the on-site tech fix something, that's extremely valuable, right? So for WebRTC, that's relatively easy to do. We see a lot more use cases in manufacturing. I mean, the most basic one is just sticking a camera in your 3D printer, but a lot of these things, and even Google Glass, which kind of got written off as a consumer product, is still out there, and there's still a lot of clones out there for industrial, agricultural type environments where you just don't have your hands, but you need to record and interact with somebody, right? These things still exist and are starting to make a comeback. So that was my talk. I finished a little bit early, I guess. I'm happy to take questions since we have plenty of time.
How do you compare the WebRTC to Google's progressive web apps? What is the big comparison?
Well, they're kind of different. I mean, the whole idea, the question was, how do you compare WebRTC to Google's progressive web apps, right? So progressive web apps was not, I mean, it was another initiative that was started by Google, but Microsoft's been very big pushing web too. And the idea of progressive web apps is that rather than going and downloading an app, that you can actually get something that looks and acts and feels like a native app, but that's actually comes from the web. WebRTC can fit into that. In my limited experimentation with it, is WebRTC doesn't. They need to do a little bit more work before they can fully bring in WebRTC into the progressive web app experience. But I think that's certainly going to happen, right? So that's just another way. If you don't have native app developers, you want to just build an app, or you just want to have a better experience on a mobile web. Progressive web apps are a way to do that, and WebRTC would be part of that. Dean.
Yeah,
Hi.
Good presentation. I haven't sort of followed some of the CPaaS stuff for a while. How do you see WebRTC stacking up against the other video platforms? I'm thinking of sort of video and Ubu and the Chinese one whose name escapes me now, things like that.
I guess maybe your question. So the question was, how does WebRTC stack up against some of the the CPaaS competitors out there? Well, I'd say most of the CPaaS competitors use WebRTC to some capacity.
Yeah.
So it's really a question: are people using CPaaSs versus just building their own thing and using WebRTC for free? I can say for sure, because some of the companies I even showed in this deck, they might start out using those CPaaSs, but then they get user traction and they get funding, and then they have to go out and build their own thing because it's not acceptable to their investors that they're going to be dependent on some other party, and they want to go in their own direction. So I kind of see I see more people starting with CPaaS but moving off of it. I don't necessarily see a lot of people starting out on their own, then deciding, hey, this is too much work, and going back to CPaaS.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the other more proprietary video APIs.
Well, I mean, you asked about video with a Y. They actually have a very big WebRTC initiative and have jumps on board. So from their perspective, at least, they are doing WebRTC, even though it's the video API, right? They try to add value, and I mean they have their existing customers, their own ecosystems, their own methodologies. Certainly, the hardest part of WebRTC is handling some of those high-scale multi-party video things, right? And that's where they specialize. So I'd say they're doing okay. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to be around the show at least through tomorrow night. So if you have other questions, feel free to find me. Thanks.